Okay, so welcome to our set of slides on the phylum Mollusca, which is our next group of organisms. And as you can see in these photos, we've got several different kinds of organisms that are shown here. Most of these organisms are soft-bodied organisms. Sometimes they have shells. You can see here and here and here. These have shells, but this one does not. And they range from microscopic in size to 20 meters long. There is somewhere between 50,000 and 200,000 different species. Generally speaking, they have a dominant region in here called the foot. They also, lots of them have a head region, and then they have a region called the visceral mass. As we've done previously, we want to look at the basic organizational aspects of this particular phylum. First off, symmetry. We looked at the sponges, who were asymmetrical here. We looked at the radially symmetrical aspects of the cnidarians. And the mollusks show the next kind of symmetry. We've skipped the worms in our little journey through marine life, and they're the first organisms in the evolutionary process to show bilateral symmetry. But the mollusks, whether they all look like it at first glance or not, do have this bilateral symmetry. And with bilateral symmetry comes the development of a head region, and as we've said in class, a highly directional lifestyle for the most part. So if you look down here, you can see the original ancestral shape of the mollusk this way. So they are long, have a head region, totally directional lifestyle. But over time, some things have happened to the shells of some mollusks, not all, in which the shells have turned in orientation and they've coiled. And this coiling process creates the opportunity for compacting more kinds of things into a smaller space, less cumbersome to carry around, but it also brings with it, as we'll talk about later, some definite challenges. So here we'll try this again. So as we did with the previous two phyla, we're going to talk a little bit about their symmetry. We do have the sponges here who show no symmetry at all for the most part. We have the radially symmetrical cnidarians, and then the mollusks are the first group of organisms that we're studying. They're going to show bilateral symmetry. And by this, it means that they usually have a head region. They have a directional lifestyle here. We can see that the orientation of this primitive mollusk is clearly in the direction of their head region. But they also show something called secondary asymmetry, which means that they're not quite fully symmetrical in the bilateral form. And as we see here, the shell here is rotating and it's also coiling. And these two things, while separate evolutionary events, have resulted in this idea of secondary asymmetry. Now this is the first group of organisms we have. As you can see, there's a stomach, there's an intestine, there's a heart, there's a nephridium, which is a primitive kidney, there's a digestive gland, there's all these things that are really indicative of it having organ level of development. So organs are present. And one of the big reasons that they can have organ level development is that this group of organisms has what's called a coelom. And the coelom is an internal body space between the inner and outer body walls that forms during embryonic development. And this space here, this is the coelomic cavity right in between the outer and inner body walls, is a space where organs can be suspended and develop. And so this is a big deal in terms of the development of organisms that have complex organ systems. So this has an organ level of development, the first group we see to have that. As I mentioned earlier, they tend to have soft bodies, distinct head region, with a major exception, and they have usually a prominent foot of some kind, a gut region that is highly important for them and prominent in terms of their body plan. But also they have this thing called a mantle. And the mantle is something that's new and unique to this particular group. And that mantle can do a number of different things. As you see here, it lays on the inner edge of the shell. So this actually makes the shell, it secretes that shell. In some, the mantle is involved in respiration because it is on the outer part of the body wall, and particularly in organisms where they are in and out of the water a lot. Some of the periwinkles, they have a vascularized mantle which allows them to exchange gases with the atmosphere. In other organisms that have lost their shell, the mantle becomes a propulsion or locomotion organ, and it also can serve in the world of communication. And we'll see how that happens when we get to the most complex group of these organisms. So as you can see here, all of these have shells right here, and it doesn't matter what the shape of the shell is secreted by this mantle structure, all right, right around the edges, and they form the shell. And as the organism grows, it adds more and more new shell material so that the organism can expand in size. The shell gets produced from three materials, and we can see this beautiful material inside of both of these shells. It's iridescent, and it's a milky, beautiful, oftentimes called a mother of pearl kind of material, but it's actually made out of, yes, calcium carbonate, we know that one, plus a protein called conchiolin, and another carbohydrate called chitin. So a mix of these three things, which forms the shell. But don't worry, because not all mollusks have a shell. Here we see some remarkably beautiful sea slugs here, highly colorful for very particular reasons, but they lack a shell. And then both the squid and the octopus don't have a shell either. They both have remnants of shells. So they had shells at one point in time, but they no longer have what we would term a shell, but they have remnants of a shell. The squid has something called a pen, which runs along the body wall of the mantle. And right up here in the head region of the octopus is a little leathery structure called a cap. So another feature that's really unusual and highly important in the mollusks is the radula. And the radula is a tongue-like structure, and you can see it right here in the mouth region. And depending on what the organism's niche is, the nature of the radula might be quite different. And it can be used either as a grazing structure, so that it actually rasps the plant material off of the rocks or chews up plant material, but it's also used in the predatory mollusks as well, sometimes as a drill. So it can rasp and scrape, or it can drill. As you see here, the electron micrographs of this particular structure are really quite something. So this is a limpet, and the limpets are grazers, right? So this is a plant-eating radula, while over here you can see some remarkable toothing to this particular radula. This is an octopus radula, and the octopus is a highly predatory organism. This really helps tear flesh apart. Two things are important here. Number one, these, generally speaking, have gill-like structures. We see the gills pictured here, and gills pictured here on the sea slug. All of these are built for gas exchange, so they have lots of blood flowing through them. That blood comes in contact with lots of water coming across the surface of the gills, and gases get exchanged. So oxygen gets taken into the bloodstream, and CO2 gets put out of the bloodstream. So their gas exchange is by diffusion over the surface of the gills. So most of the gill structures have lots and lots of folds of some kind in order to enhance the amount of surface area to make them more efficient at exchanging gases. So the second idea here is, how is the size of the gill itself related to the lifestyle of the organism? And generally speaking, if you look here, this is a mussel here, or a clam, and that gill structure is really quite large in relationship to the rest of the body. So here are the ends of the gills, and the rest of the body is not all that much larger. Over in these two, the gills are a lot smaller. Generally speaking, the more sedentary the organism is, the larger the gills. The more movement the organism has in its lifestyle, then the smaller the gills tend to be. So it's an inverse relationship between amount of movement and size of the gill. So the other measure that we use in terms of looking at complexity is, what do we see in terms of the body systems in this set of organisms? And here's the diagrammatic picture of a clam, right? There's two different ones here. But what we want to highlight is the fact that it actually has a heart, right here, right? And then it has blood vessels coming out of the heart. So, and then also going at some point back in. But notice that there's this gap in places right here and right here, right, and right here. What this means is that there are no connections between the artery part of the circulatory system and the vein part of the circulatory system, where we would have capillaries ourselves. And so what this means is that they have an open circulatory system. So they have a full circulatory system, but it happens to be open in nature, meaning that the blood is not always contained in vessels. Some of it leaks out in these little spaces, these little sinuses here, and then it's kind of inefficient picking it back up and taking it back towards the heart. So, circulatory system, right? You can clearly see that they have a kidney, right? So they have an excretory system as well. So we have organs, right? Okay. Then we have a stomach, a digestive gland, intestines, right? So they have a very well developed digestive system. All right. And what we don't see here particularly well in this group itself, but if you look down here, it says ganglion, right? So this is the concentration of neurons. In this case, it happens to be around the gut area, all right? And it is indicative of its nervous system. So it has both sensory structures as well as neurons that connect. And in the bivalves, we see a different situation than we will see in the other two classes of organisms. So as we did in the previous two different groups of organisms that we've examined so far, we wanted to look at how are they grouped, how are they divided up by scientists in order to categorize them in a way that's going to make sense. So here we have the different photos here of 5 major classes. There's 7 classes of mollusks, but the 5 major classes are divided from each other based on their type of shell, the shape of the shell, the kind of foot, and then the most well-developed body region that they have. All right, and I've labeled these 5 different types of mollusks here. This, as you can see, just has a single sectional unit. These are actually incredibly primitive. Were not thought to still be around, but were just rediscovered a while ago. And so these are the monoplacophorans here. Mono, and then placophoran. This, notice it's got all the dividers in the shell here. This is a chitin, so this is a polyplacophoran. We'll see this in just a second. Placophoran. And then we have here the gastropods, which we'll see coming up, the bivalves, and then finally the cephalopods. These are the 3 major groups that we'll spend most of our time with. And I won't write them here because we'll see all those terms later. So here you can see an internal diagram of a monoplacophoran. Here's the external shell, right? These are single-shelled, right? This is important, one shell, and they look like ancestral limpets. Some, they've got kidneys, gills, and hearts are repeated serially. And it's really an old group of mollusks that live in the deep ocean and eat detritus. Here's the polyplacophora. Poly again means many. This means many plates. So these are the chitins. We'll see these here in Maine. We also see them in the tropics, and you can see that there's little separate plates in each of the shell regions here. So this is not a contiguous shell, but separate plates with some separations. And they're really cool critters that stick themselves hard to the rock. And it's just the number of plates that separates them from the monoplacophorans. Here you can see that they tend to have 8 overlapping plates. If you were to count them, you could see those here. Huge foot. Sometimes that foot comes all the way up over the edges of the shell. They live mostly in the intertidal to shallow subtidal, although some of them are deep water organisms. And they are grazers and also eat material that they can take. So this is an interesting looking mollusk, and you might look at this and say, not quite sure what that is. But we'll see in just a second that it's got an interesting way of feeding. Here's a diagram of it, and you can see that it sticks this end up out of the sand. The business end, however, is down here at the bottom. You can see that this is a foot. This is actually a muscular foot here. Uses to dig. These are feeding tentacles here, which can extract food materials from the sand. Excuse me. You can also see it has a little radula right there. So it's a tusk shell or a scaphopod. But now this is where we get down to business, because this is the group, the first group that we're going to look at, the gastropods. All right, so this gastro, we know what that means. That means basically eat or digest. So this really means stomach, foot, right? The poda means foot. So these are the stomach foots, the snails and the slugs. We got the periwinkles, the whelks, the conchs, the sea slugs, and the limpets. All of these are members of this particular class, the gastropods. You can see some of them have shells and some of them do not. The next major group is the bivalves. This really gives it away, given that bi means two. So they all have two shells here. Very common organisms that we're familiar with. So hard shell clams, the scallop, and mussels. And then finally, the most interesting group in my view, but also the most complex in terms of behavior, we've got the squid and the nautilus and the octopus among the members of the group cephalopod, right? And if you look at this, the nautilus still has a shell, but the squid and the octopus, as we said earlier, don't have a shell. So many of them have lost their shells or modified their shells. So the rest of these slides will just deal with the gastropods. We're going to consider how many valves they have. This means parts to the shell. What kind of symmetry? What are the most developed body regions in the organism? What did they use their radula for? How do they respire? And what kind of sense organs do they have? So these gastropods, if they have a shell, are all one-shelled organisms or univalve organisms. Whether you are a whelk-like structure, or you have a periwinkle-like structure, or some other more exotic tropical kind of shape. So the sea slugs lack a shell, right? So they've given up the shell over time. And the question is, why would they do that? What are the benefits to having no shell, and what are the drawbacks to having no shell? And then what the heck are the structures on the backs, right? If you look at all of these sea slugs, right? They all have some kind of material on their back. So the benefits of giving up the shell has to do with mobility, right? And not having to secrete the shell energetically in order to grow and then erode some of the shell to keep growing, right? So that they are saving energy and they're more mobile. The drawback, clearly, less protection. And then you look at the structures here on the back. These are gills, basically, for most of them. Some of them are structures in which they store the nematocysts from the hydra that they eat. So some sea slugs can eat hydra, digest their nematocysts, and store the toxins in the back to protect themselves. Not true for all sea slugs, but for some. So as we mentioned before, these gastropods have a secondary asymmetry. You can see that they start out here, they're totally bilaterally symmetrical, but as they develop their shell, they have this secondary asymmetry. And as these gastropods evolved over time, two important things happened to their body plan that come from having just one shell, having a head region, and then having the digestive system, which actually originally ran straight through the organism from front end to back, but with a shell it creates some challenges. So two things have happened. One, we can see that there's this whole coiling process here. The coiling was one of the important events in the development of these organisms. The second thing that happened over time was something called torsion, which is really like a U-turn kind of process. You can see here that here's the mouth and here's the anus, and the digestive system was flow through this way. But as the shell developed as a protective shell, and this is very separate from the coiling process, the digestive system began to make a U-turn. So it eventually made a little right angle here, and then finally we see the digestive system make a full U-turn, so that rather than fouling in the back of the shell here, you can end up with the waste being excreted out in the front area of the shell. The problem is that this creates a disadvantage. And you only have to think about one real thing here. A, this is where food goes in. B, food comes out right nearby. So here we can see that this is a wholly other kind of process. This coiling here, right, which you can see adds layer upon layer upon layer upon layer, right, in the process of shell development. The body, right, is following this process, and clearly we have the biggest part here, the smallest part at the end. And the coiling created an opportunity for the organism to compact more body into smaller space without it being too awkward to haul this shell around. The challenge here is that when you coil always in this direction, in this case, so we can see, it's coiling to the right as it moves in this way, the right side organs get compressed. So those organs over time got so compressed that they actually lose their function. So the organs get compressed and lose their function on the right side. Now, as you can imagine, gastropods are pretty slow movers, but they are definitely movers. And in the gastropod body plan, we've got this big foot. You can see it here, you can see it here. And clearly that foot is muscular in nature. So the question is, how do they extend the foot and draw it back in order to create locomotion with the foot? And this is a really interesting concept in the world of mollusk locomotion. But they actually fill the muscular foot with blood to expand it, and then they contract the muscle fibers in that in order to create movement. So the expansion is basically an inflation with blood, and then the contraction is the muscular part of it. As we continue through the key molluscan characteristics, just to repeat this, that idea of the radula is this tongue-like structure. Here are the radular teeth, right? And the different kinds of mollusks have different kinds of teeth in their radula depending on what they use it for. Right? They've got a muscle which actually allows them to stick the radula out, and also a muscle that draws it back in. So they have both kinds of musculature there, and the radula is something that kind of keeps unfolding as the organism grows. It wears down the teeth on the radula, and over time they'll unfurl a little bit more of the radula and keep on using it, and then the tips wear out. So as we've talked about before, the idea that bilateral symmetry means that you end up with a head region and a directional lifestyle. So head and direction. And consequently, they've got some sense organs that allow them to take in information from the front end, right? So the directional organisms have a real concentration of sense organs up in the area that encounters the environment first. So they've got actual eye structures, and they've got tentacles, and they have a real brain-like, right? The cerebral ganglion is really the basics of the brain, right? So you can see here that they clearly have sense organs concentrated in the region of the head, right? So they have their eyes, they've got tentacles there, so they're taking in sensory information in the form of light, in the form of touch, and also in the form of chemical information. So they've got a mouth which they're sampling. They also have a primitive brain, the cerebral ganglion. All of this connected to its having a head region and a directional lifestyle. One other thing from this particular diagrams, you can see that they have both a penis and a vagina. So some of these tend to be hermaphroditic. They can both fertilize and be fertilized in their reproductive process, and they're exclusively sexual in their reproduction. As we spoke about briefly before, they have a digestive system which involves intake of food at the mouth. They actually have a crop, which is a place where things get kind of chewed up before they get to the stomach, sort of like birds have a crop. All right, they have a stomach region here where digestion takes place. They have a digestive gland, so clearly they have extracellular digestion. And then they have a long intestine for processing the nutrients. And then as you can see here, here is the entry. Then the digestive system curves all the way around and comes out right up in here, just above the head region underneath the rim of the shell. Just to reiterate, they do have gills, right? So they are extracting gases from the water by water passing over the gills, having blood vessels ride right next to that in order to get the oxygen from the water and also in order to give CO2 back into the water. So here we have examples of an open and closed circulatory system. This is the open circulatory system, whereas the gap between the blood vessels, so blood comes out of these vessels, enters a sinus space. This opening right here we call a sinus, and then it gets collected back up in the next blood vessel. In this situation, we see a closed circulatory system. This is when the blood never leaves the vessels, always contained. This one is far more efficient in nature, and the mollusks all have open circulatory systems. While many of these organisms are grazers, this particular kind of snail here, the moon snail, which has this huge foot and this coiling shell, very common in the sandy shore parts of the Gulf of Maine. It is, if you look here and here, you can see some indications as to how it feeds. Its radula is tremendously capable, using some acid to help, of drilling holes through the shells of its bivalve prey. So it will drill through these and then stick the radula down, and it will suck the organism's body, the soft body parts, right out of the shell and feed on it. So if you ever find a soft-shell clam or other kind of clam on the beach with this beautifully drilled round hole, you'll know that the moon snail took advantage of that particular slow-moving bivalve and ate it right out of its shell. So that's our little tour of the gastropods for tonight. You'll have some questions to answer that are based on these slides, and then we'll be spending time in the lab looking at these organisms in comparison to the bivalves, and hopefully we'll get a good sense of the first two groups of mollusks from that work.